which is very kind of him, and he's certainly well known in the Perth Archdiocese. Very close friend of the Archbishop, they have many meetings together. But he is part of the church that has taken a stand on some of the issues that are affecting us today, so he deserves all of our support, and I shall hand you over to him now.
First of all, I'd like to welcome you here. I also welcome all of the speakers. It was a joy to listen to them. My name is Father Pavol, as it was mentioned. I'm from Slovakia. I'm from middle of Europe. Czechoslovakia was part of the communist system. I came here in 2003, and I could believe actually when communist system fall in Czechoslovakia I was 12 years old. But a lot of government and officials reminds me something what I experienced when I was 12 years old. Now, my topic today is finding meaning in senseless world. What do you think how the world feels today? The world feels today feel us more frightened and demoralizing than ever before. We find that our increased awareness of the instability of our world is deeply unsettling. For many of us, this challenges not only our feelings of existential security, but also our entire sense of meaning in life. That sense of meaning is heavily shaped by our worldview. Much of the human suffering is directly attributed to this loss of meaning. And the meaning vacuum must be filled. That is, the person must find a way to be able to think and feel in broadly meaningful terms again. What creates this meaning of vacuum? Society without any objective legal scale is a terrible one indeed. But a society with no other scale than the legal one is not quite worthy of man either. Society which is based on the letter of the law and never reaches any higher is taking very scarce advantage of the high level of human possibilities. The letter of the law is too cold and formal to have a beneficial influence on society. Whenever the tissue of life is woven in the legalistic relationships, there is an atmosphere of moral, we call mediocrity, and almost paralyzing and man's noble impulses. And it will be simply impossible to stand to the trials of threatening time with only support of the legalistic structure. The defense of individual rights, we know, has reached such extreme today as to make society as a whole defenseless against certain individuals. It is time in our world to defend not so much human rights, but also human obligations. And also, destructive and irresponsible freedom in our world has been granted a boundless space. Society appears to have a little defense against the abyss of the human decadence, such as, for example, misuse of the liberty for moral violence against young people, such as full of pornography. It is considered to be a part of the freedom and a kind of theoretical counterbalanced by the young people's right not to look or not to accept. Therefore, life organized legalistically has thus shown its inability to defend itself against a corrosion of evil. And this new way of thinking, which had imposed on us its guidance, did not admit the existence of intrinsic evil in man, nor did it see any higher task than the attainment of happiness on earth. It based modern Western civilization on the dangerous trend to worship man and his material needs. Because everything beyond physical well-being and accumulation of material things and goods, all other requirements and the characteristic of the subtle and also the higher mature were left outside in the area of attention of the state and social system. As human life did not have, as if human life did not have any superior sense. Therefore, the state system were becoming increasingly and totally materialistic. The modern era ended up by truly enforcing human rights, sometimes even excessively. But what we notice that the sense of the responsibility to God and to the society grew dimmer and dimmer. And we can see in the past decades the legalistically selfish aspect of modern approach to everything in our society and thinking has reached its final dimension. And that we see the world is wound up in a harsh spiritual crisis. And we can see also a political impasse. Most of the things state does now has no meaning and many times doesn't make sense. As a humanistic in development, because more and more materialistic, it made so intrinsically accessible, not only to speculation, but also the possibility leading to socialism and communism. So we can say the word of Karl Marx. That Karl Marx was able to say that the communism is naturalized a humanism. Therefore, we have placed too much hope in the political and social reforms, only to find out that we are being deprived of the most precious possession, our spiritual life. If humanism were right in declaring the man is born only to be happy, he would not be born to die. And since his body is doomed to die, his task on earth evidently must be more spiritual sense. It cannot be unrestrained enjoyment of everyday life. It cannot be search for the best ways to obtain material goods and then cheerfully get most of them. It has to be fulfillment of the permanent, earnest duty of the life's journey that may become an experience of moral and also spiritual growth, so that one may live life better human being than one started it. Therefore, it is imperative to review the table of the widespread human values. Its present incorrectness is astounding. It is not possible to the assessment of the President's, Premier or the Prime Minister performance to be reduced to the question how much money one makes or about the material prosperity. We know that only voluntary, inspired self-restraint can raise men above the world stream of materialism. We need to return and to relearn in our day the relationship between the common sense and both philosophy and faith. Pope Benedict XVI calls for the renewal of the culture, truth, and bring new guidance into the politics with Christian values. Culture is the root of politics, and the religion is the root of culture. It shouldn't come to surprise that the virtue of knowing what is truly good can also help us to make our work more meaningful, and also guide us to renewal of the values of the public life. Common sense is sound judgment and practical matter. In Proverbs, some translations speak of the need to develop a common sense in our society, which other translations simply call a prudence. A prudence is one of the virtues. Prudence is the virtue that disposes practical reason to discern our true good in every circumstances and to choose the right means to achieving it. Prudence is also the right reason in action, according to St. Thomas Aquinas. With the help of this virtue, we apply moral principle and particular cases without error, and also overcome doubts about the good to achieve and the evil to avoid. In the book of Proverbs, proclaims the benefit of gaining wisdom. Proverbs says, "Blessed are those who find wisdom, those who gain understanding. For she is more profitable than silver and yield better returns than gold." Wisdom allows us to see life in the way that God does. And when we see God's perspective, we can make decisions based upon the eternal significance rather than selfish interests. When we choose to make decisions based on the wisdom alone, we are exercising common sense. And St. Augustine gives its priority to common sense over religion. If your religion contradicts common sense, your religion is wrong, and the common sense is right. We can apply the same to the state. The desire for instant gratification is always the enemy of common sense. Many people have become ensnared in trouble and heartache because they rejected a wise path and sought instead immediate satisfaction. Therefore, the difference between the wise and the foolish is that one learns from its mistake and other keeps repeating them. Either way, wisdom and common sense should be continually pursued in order to experience the best God has for us. Now we can ask the simple question, a key question. Why are holy places dark places? The cross, the tomb, and the stable. They are holy because even in the dark night of God is work and is breaking through. In other words, why does God not show himself more clearly? Why is there so many seemingly senseless suffering in the world to which God seems to be absent? Cassiper Lewis addressed the most existential questions in his book, Till We Have Faces. And he addresses some of the most existential questions. Lewis' answer is that we cannot understand this existential question till we have faith, until we have cleansed ourselves enough interiorly so as to be able to talk to God face to face and not project our inner darkness onto the world around us. Therefore, confronting darkness within us is a task we are all called to take on with God's help. The holy places must be dark places for two reasons. One, because the darkness is in our soul, and we project then that onto the God that we try to find. And there has to be a trust. God can reveal himself totally to us and still elicit from us the loving trust that he wants above all in our relationship with him. Why is there so much seemingly senseless suffering in the world, to which God seems to be absent? Suffering is like an operation. God has to get in there, not as a to do the heart surgery. It can't be merely an addition. It has to be complete subtraction. He has to take out the cancer cells. On the higher level, pain and suffering shatters yet another illusion, that we are self-sufficient, that all we have is our own doing. Solzhenitsyn saw that suffering led to the spiritual ascent. Solzhenitsyn discusses the personal growth one can achieve through the suffering and the ripening of the soul that occurs when one's freedom is taken away. He also discovered in times of extreme suffering, challenges and difficulties that one is able to understand that in life it is not the result that counts, but the spirit with which the individual arms himself with. We know the suffering doesn't destroy the meaning in our life. Suffering presupposes meaning. As Viktor Frankl says, if life has meaning, then suffering has a meaning as well, because suffering is an essential part of our life. A life without suffering would be not life at all. It wouldn't be even grow, because to grow is to suffer and to leave the past. We can say that despair is a suffering without the meaning. According to the psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, who survived the concentration camp in Auschwitz, he said, since suffering is the inevitable part of our life, those who suffer must try to find meaning to it. The alternative is to view suffering as a waste of life, as senseless or useless experience. Therefore, Dr. Frankl writes, despair is a suffering without meaning. Those who despair of the suffering may find life very unbearable. Viktor Frankl discovered in Auschwitz that the prisoners that survived were not necessarily the healthy one or the privileged one. There were those that had a meaning, especially the meaning to their suffering. And he concluded that a man can endure almost any how if only he has a why. Choosing to find a meaning in suffering. According to the Frankl, life can be made meaningful through the stand we take towards the fate we no longer can change. And since human beings have free will, they must choose to see a meaning to their suffering. What makes the difference between despair and a meaning? Frankl answered, the attitude we choose towards the suffering. Meaning rests on the attitude the patient chooses towards suffering. It is then better to choose to find a meaning in suffering than to suffer in despair. And we are in this situation and in our world caught in the hopeless situation. And sometimes we can be helpless victims, facing a fate we cannot be changed. And man still may turn his predicament into achievement and accomplishment at the human level. Why? Because it does may bear witness to the human potential at its best, which is to turn the tragedy, challenge, or the suffering to the triumph. The other things, to the suffering, we can becoming bitter or better. Frankl and Holocaust survival recalls the negative and positive responses of the prisoners to the suffering in the Nazi concentration camp. He says that the person may remain brave, dignified, and unselfish. Or in the bitter fight for self-preservation, he may forget his human dignity and become no more than an animal. The kind of person, then, that one becomes in suffering is the result of an inner decision, not the result of the suffering alone. We can be ennobled, not degraded by suffering. Of course, in itself, suffering is certainly not good. However, it can be turned into the good deed. It can be turned to the moral value by the way a person bears up under it. Frankl teaches that suffering can make the person or break the person, either ennobling or degrading. To support his teaching, Frankl said, and quotes the Russian novelist Dostoevsky, "There is only one thing that I dread, not to be worthy of my sufferings." Suffering in itself need not to be a waste of life. But however, there is a lot of wasted suffering in the world, because many people will not choose to find a meaning in it. It is making their suffering senseless instead of making sense of suffering. And it is not just the will of the life, it is the belief, a faith, a trust that all life, including suffering, has a meaning and has an outcome. You can argue, for instance, that the good things in life are obviously meaningful and have a purpose. Our desire for good things and attractive things and beautiful things are satisfied by all sorts of good things in the world. And if our desire for the better world, a more perfect world, a more just world, is meaningless, therefore the deepest desire in our soul is also meaningless, and all the others ones are also. In other words, all the appetizers, all the little desires we we have real satisfaction. But when it comes to the main course, there is no such thing. What we really hungry for most deeply doesn't exist. That makes no sense at all. If every natural and innate desire says something about the world as well as something about us, if every hunger points to some food, that the implicit hunger to God in heaven, which even atheists often admit is innate in the human soul, that points to it. Suffering doesn't destroy meaning. Suffering presupposes the meaning. But there is higher meaning than the suffering, and that makes senseless life meaningful. Is a true love. Unlike popular sentimental substitutes, is the willing to suffer. Love is not love, love is the cross. Our problem at first, the sheer problem of suffering, was a cross without the Christ. But we must never fall into the opposite, an equal trap of a Christ without the cross. Look at the crucifix. St. Bernard Clairvaux says that whatever he does, and look at the crucifix, the Christ 5 wounds appear to him as a lips speaking the words, I love you. Jesus did 3 things to solve the problem of suffering. First, he came, he suffered with us. He wept. Second, in becoming man, he transformed the meaning of our suffering. It is not now part of his work of redemption. Therefore, we know the law without love breeds legalism. Love without law breeds sentimentalism. Suffering without love breeds bitterness and meaninglessness. Therefore, Augustine once said in sermon, put love in all the things that you do, and they will make sense. Take love away, and they become worthless and empty, void and senseless. Therefore, at the heart of Augustine, education of philosophy is the primacy of the love of learning, love of writers, the love of truth, goodness, and beauty. Man cannot live without love. He remains a being that is incomprehensible for himself. His life is senseless if love is not revealed to him. If he does not encounter love, if he does not experience it and make it his own, if he does not participate intimately in it. Therefore, finding a meaning in the senseless world is to find Christ, God, love, and a meaning in our suffering. Thank you very much for listening.